Methods of data collection, interview. Social research involves using different data collection techniques. Interview data collection involves an interviewer asking questions to an interviewee. It is a one-of-one method of data collection. The questions are structured according to the purpose of the interview. This usually adheres to the research objectives. The two major functions of interview data collection are description and exploration. An interview may be structured, where you ask clearly defined questions, or unstructured, where you allow some of questioning to be led by the responses of the interview. Especially when using unstructured interviews, using a tape recorder can be a good idea if it does not affect the relationship with the person being interviewed. What is an interview? An interview is a method of asking quantitative or qualitative questions orally of key participants. Quantitative questions are close-ended and have specific answers to choose among that can be categorized and numerically analyzed. Qualitative questions are open-ended, that is, the respondent provides a response in his or her own words. Interviews conducted for program evaluation are typically qualitative but may also include some quantitative questions. There are three approaches to qualitative interviews that vary in their level of structure and can be combined. Informal conversational interviews are the least structured. The wording of the questions and topics to be discussed are not predetermined. These types of interviews often occur spontaneously. Semi-structured interviews include an outline of topics or issues to be covered, but the interviewer is free to vary the wording and order of the questions. Standardized open-ended interviews are the most structured and include a set of protocol of questions and probes. The interviewer is not allowed flexibility in the wording or order. Functions and characteristics of interview. Two major functions of the interview techniques are description, exploration. Description. The information received from the respondent provides insight into the nature of social reliance. Since the interviewer spends some time with the respondents, he can understand their feelings and attitudes more clearly and seek additional information wherever necessary and make information meaningful for him. Exploration. Exploration, the response given by interviewees, could help in understanding new areas under the research work. This could be used to develop other methods such as questionnaires. As a method of data collection, interviews are personal, the status of the interviewer and interviewee are equal. A rapport is established between the two individuals. We will now look at the characteristics of an interview. Personal communication. Equal status. The status of the interviewer and the interviewee is equal. Instant response. Temporary relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee. Considerable flexibility in the format of the interview. How do you plan for interviews? Successful interviews start with thorough planning. Determine your focus. Think about the evaluation questions you want to answer and make sure that you include only interview questions that will answer your evaluation questions. Develop an interview guide or questionnaire. The specificity of written interview guidance will vary depending on the type of interview you are conducting. For an informal conversational interview, you will probably not prepare any interview guidance. For a semi-structured interview, your interview guidance might include specific topics to be covered in the interview and may also include some questions. For a standardized open-ended interview, you will need to develop all your questions, the order of the questions and probes. Probes are a way to clarify a response to a question by asking more detailed follow-up questions. Select the number and type of people to be interviewed. Select the type of people you want to interview to answer your evaluation questions. You should also decide if you should include all possible participants or if a sample will suffice. This will depend on the number of possible participants and the resources you have available. Train the interviewers. If other people are interviewing your respondents, they will need to be trained in how to conduct an interview and on your interview guide. Ensure respondents confidential. Determine how you will maintain confidentiality of respondents and provide respondents with information about how you will do so. Pilot test the interview guide or questionnaire. Pilot testing allows you to identify questions that may be confusing to or misinterpreted by your respondents. Pilot testing typically involves conducting a few interviews and then determining if any changes are needed to the interview guide or questionnaire. Conditions for a successful interview. Collecting data through the interview technique may be easy, yet its adequacy, reliability, and validity pose important problems. Interviewers differ in interest and skill. Respondents differ in ability and motivation. Gardner has pointed out 3 conditions for successful interviewing: accessibility, understanding, motivations. Accessibility. For giving information to the interviewer, the respondent must have access to the information. Understanding. The respondent sometimes is not able to understand what is expected of him. Unless he understands the significance of the research, the concepts and terms used, the nature of answers which the interviewer expects from him, his answers might be out of track. Motivation. The respondent needs to be motivated not only for giving information but also giving accurate information. The fear of consequences, being suspicious about the interviewer, and dislike of the subject are some of the factors which decrease the level of respondents' motivation. The interviewer, therefore, has to try to reduce the effect of these factors. Developing the interview. Before an interview takes place, respondents should be informed about the study details and given assurance about ethical principles such as anonymity and confidentiality. This gives respondents some idea of what to expect from the interview, increases the likelihood of honesty, and is also a fundamental aspect of the informed consent process. Wherever possible, interviews should be conducted in areas free from distractions and at times and locations that are most suitable for participants. For many, this may be at their own home in the evenings. Whilst researchers may have less control over the home environment, familiarity may help the respondent to relax and result in a more productive interview. Establishing rapport with the participants prior to the interview is also important, as this can also have a positive effect on the subsequent development of the interview. When conducting the actual interview, it is prudent for the interviewer to familiarize themselves with the interview schedule so that the process appears more natural and less rehearsed. However, to ensure that the interview is as productive as possible, researchers must possess a repertoire of skills and techniques to ensure that comprehensive and representative data are collected during the interview. One of the most important skills is ability to listen attentively to what is being said, so that participants are able to recount their experiences as fully as possible without unnecessary interruptions. Other important skills include adopting open and emotionally neutral body language, nodding, smiling, and looking interested, and making encouraging noises during the interview. The strategic use of silence, if used appropriately, can also be highly effective at getting respondents to contemplate their responses, talk more, elaborate, or clarify particular issues. Interviews further include reflecting on remarks made by participants, example pain, and probing remarks. When you said you were afraid of going to the dentist, what did you mean? Where appropriate, it is also wise to seek clarification from respondents if it is unclear what they mean. The use of leading or loaded questions that may unduly influence responses should always be avoided. Example, so you think dental surgery waiting rooms are frightening? Rather than, how do you find the waiting room at the dentist's? At the end of the interview, it is important to thank participants for their time and ask them if there is anything they would like to add. This gives the respondents an opportunity to deal with issues that they have thought about or think are important but have not been dealt with by the interviewer. This can often lead to the discovery of new, unanticipated information. Respondents should also be debriefed about the study after the interview has finished. All interviews should be tape recorded and transcribed verbatim afterwards, as this protects against bias and provides a permanent record of what was and was not said. It is often also helpful to make field notes during and immediately after each interview about observations, thoughts and ideas about the interview, as this can help in data analysis process. How do you conduct interviews and what is the role of an interviewer? Few things which we need to follow to conduct an interview are: build trust and establish rapport. It is important that your respondent feels comfortable answering questions honestly. Providing the respondent with appropriate assurances of confidentiality will help you build trust. During the interview, show empathy, listen actively, and maintain eye contact. You may also want to start with less sensitive questions before asking more sensitive, controversial questions. Keep a neutral demeanor. Most respondents will not want to say things that they feel you disagree with, so it is important that you not show strong reactions or emotions. Stay in control of the interview. Although it is important to allow for flexibility during the interview, you also need to set the direction for the interview and keep the respondent from straying from the topics you plan to discuss. The role of the interviewer. The interviewer is really the jack of all trades in research. The interviewer's role is complex and multifaceted. Let us now discuss about it. Locate and enlist cooperation of respondents. The interviewer has to find the respondent. In door-to-door surveys, this means being able to locate specific addresses. Often the interviewer has to work at the least desirable times, like immediately after dinner or on weekends, because that's when respondents are most readily available. Motivate respondents to do a good job. If the interviewer does not take the work seriously, why would the respondent? The interviewer has to be motivated and has to be able to communicate that motivation to the respondent. Often this means that the interviewer has to be convinced of the importance of the research. Clarify any confusion or concerns. Interviewers have to be able to think on their feet. Respondents may raise objections or concerns that were not anticipated. The interviewer has to be able to respond candidly and informatively. Observe quality of responses. Whether the interview is personal or over the phone, the interviewer is in the best position to judge the quality of the information that is being received. Even a verbatim transcript will not adequately convey how seriously the respondent took the task, or any gestures or body language that was evident. Conduct a good interview. Last and certainly not least, the interviewer has to conduct a good interview. Every interview has a life of its own. Some respondents are motivated and attentive, others are distracted or disinterested. The interviewer also has good or bad days. Assuring a consistently high quality interview is a challenge that requires constant effort. Types of interviews. There are various types of interviews with which we can collect data, We will look at few of them now. Unstructured. There are no specifications in the wording of the questions or the order of the questions. The interviewer forms questions as and when required. The structure of the interview is flexible. Structured. Structured interview is based on the structured interview guide, which is little different from the questionnaire. It is a set of specific points and definite questions prepared by the interviewer. Standardized. In standardized interviews, answer to each question is standardized as it is determined by a set of response categories given for this purpose. The respondents are expected to choose one of the given options as the answer. Unstandardized. In this type of interviews, responses are left open to the respondent. This is used mainly in qualitative research. Individual. In this type, the interviewer interviews only one respondent at a time. Group interview. More than one respondent are interviewed simultaneously. The group can be small, say of 2 individuals. Example, husband and wife, or 2 co-workers in a factory, or large, say of 10 to 20 persons, say students in a class. Self-administered. The respondent is supplied a list of questions along with instructions for writing answers in the appropriate place on the interview form. Other administered. The interviewer himself writes answers to questions on the response sheet. Unique is one which the interviewer collects entire information in one interview. Panel interviews. The interviewer collects information from the same group of respondents 2 or more times at regular intervals. If different respondents are involved in various stages for asking the same question, it is called trend study. Soft interview. Here, the interviewer guides the respondents without putting any pressure on them. Hard interview. Here, the interview resembles a police interrogation. The interviewer questions the validity and completeness of the answers obtained, often warning the respondents not to lie and forcing them to give an answer when they hesitate. Personal interviews. There is face-to-face contact between the interviewer and the interviewee. Non-personal interviews. No face-to-face contact, but the information is collected through telephone, computer, or some other medium. Preparing the interviewers. One of the most important aspects of any interview study is the preparation of the interviewers themselves. In many ways, the interviewers are your measures, and the quality of the results is totally in their hands. Even in small studies involving only a single researcher interviewer, it is important to organize in detail and rehearse the interviewing process before beginning the formal study. Let us now look at few of the topics on which interviewers must be prepared. Describe the entire study. Interviewers need to know more than simply how to conduct the interview itself. They should learn about the background for the study, previous work that has been done, and why the study is important. State who is sponsor of research. Interviewers need to know who they are working for. They and their respondents have a right to know not just what agency or company is conducting the research, but also who is paying for the research. Teach enough about survey research. While you seldom have the time to teach a full course on survey research methods, the interviewers need to know enough that they respect the survey method and are motivated. Sometimes it may not be apparent why a question or set of questions was asked in a particular way. The interviewers will need to understand the rationale for how the instrument was constructed. Explain the sampling logic and process. Naive interviewers may not understand why sampling is so important. They may wonder why you go through all the difficulties of selecting the sample so carefully. You will have to explain that sampling is the basis for the conclusions that will be researched and for the degree to which your study will be useful. Explain interviewer bias. Interviewers need to know the many ways that they can inadvertently bias the results, and they need to understand why it is important and they not bias the study. This is especially a problem when you are investigating political or moral issues on which people have strongly held convictions. While the interviewer may think they are doing good for society by slanting results in favor of what they believe, they need to recognize that doing so could jeopardize the entire study in the eyes of others. Walk through the interview. When you first introduce the interview, it's a good idea to walk through the entire protocol so the interviewers can get an idea of the various parts or phases and how they interrelate. Identifying households. In many studies, it is impossible in advance to say whether every sample household meets the sampling requirements for the study. In your study, you may want to interview only people who live in single-family homes. It may be impossible to distinguish townhouses and apartment buildings in your sampling frame. The interviewer must know how to identify the appropriate target household. Identify response. Just as with households, many studies require respondents who meet specific criteria. For instance, your study may require that you speak with a male head of the household between the ages of 30 and 40 who has children under 18 living in the same household. It may be impossible to obtain statistics in advance to target such respondents. The interviewer may have to ask a series of filtering questions before determining whether the respondent meets the sampling needs. Rehearse interview. You should probably have several rehearsal sessions with the interviewer team. You might even videotape rehearsal interviews to discuss how the trainees responded in difficult situations. The interviewers should be very familiar with the entire interview before ever facing a respondent. Explain supervision. In most interview studies, the interviewers will work under the direction of a supervisor. In some contexts, the supervisor may be a faculty advisor. In others, they may be the boss. In order to assure the quality of the responses, the supervisor may have to observe a subsample of interviews, listen in on phone interviews, or conduct follow-up assessments of interviews with the respondents. This can be very threatening to the interviewers. You need to develop an atmosphere where everyone on the research team, interviewers and supervisors, feel like they are working together towards a common end. Explain scheduling. The interviewers have to understand the demands being made on their schedules and why these are important to the study. In some studies, it will be imperative to conduct the entire set of interviews within a certain time period. In most studies, it's important to have the interviewers available when it's convenient for the respondents, not necessarily the interviewer. Interviews are a useful method to investigate issues in depth way. It helps to discover how individuals think and feel about a subject under analysis. It helps in decision making, strategic planning, and add a human dimension to impersonal data. It also deepens the understanding and explains statistical data. Interviews are very helpful for social researchers to get an insight into their social problem they are trying to analyze. They can find out more details of a particular area. It is exploratory in nature. Descriptive responses help in understanding an area in depth. Interview data collection can help social researchers get more personal opinions of the target segment. Their attitudes and perceptions can be understood using this technique.